sort of the thick of the crisis, the Federal Reserve used a lot of discretionary economic power in taking over AIG and things like this that were criticized immensely for it afterwards. And what I would ask you is, how do you sort of strike a balance between making the Fed accountable and ensuring that they do have the flexibility to respond?
It is essential, one of the central questions. First of all, let me say, I hear the Republicans now complaining about bailouts. That is the most heartfelt and impressive set of confessions, I think, since St. Augustine. Every single activity of the federal government that is now going on that is called a bailout, AIG, the TARP program for banks, General Motors, Chrysler, anything else, was initiated by the Bush administration. In some cases with congressional approval, in other cases with no congressional approval. 14 months ago, Ben Bernanke, Bush's appointee to chair the Federal Reserve, and Hank Paulson, his Secretary of Treasury, came to us in Congress and said, we have just decided to give $82 billion to AIG. I said, you have $82 billion. Mr. Bernanke said, no, I have $800 billion. And so here's what we're trying to do. I do think, in fairness to them, they had very little choice. We're trying to do this in several ways. First of all, we are going to adopt policies that will keep them from getting in this trouble in the first place. AIG got in trouble because they were issuing something called credit default swaps. Credit default swaps are a form of insurance. AIG was insuring other financial companies against a loss in value of their mortgage-backed securities. And AIG didn't have any reserves to do that. Now, if you buy automobile insurance or homeowner insurance, you buy life insurance at some point, that's state regulated. And a state insurance commissioner makes sure that the company that sells you the policy has the ability to pay it off, or else they can't sell the policy. But it's my point from before. But credit default swaps were a new form of financial activity. There were no rules for it. It wasn't anybody deregulated. They came up and there were no rules. They were a form of insurance that fell outside of insurance law. So they did not have to back it up. So they issued trillions of dollars of credit default swaps, which they did not have the money to pay off. What happened was they issued them against securities that people owned that were based on mortgages. But what happened to the mortgages? They began to collapse because a lot of them were the mortgages that shouldn't have been issued in the first place, subprime mortgages to very low-income people, which, by the way, Democrats tried to stop. And now Greenbed said, no, that's too regulatory. So here's what happens. AIG gets overextended because it insures these mortgage-based securities, and they didn't think they would have to pay them up. If you want to know how can you do that, think about somebody who decided to go into the business of selling life insurance to vampires. And AIG thought they were selling life insurance to vampires, but then the vampires started to die, and they didn't have the money to pay them up. So here's what we're doing. First of all, we are going to pass a law that will stop those bad mortgages from being issued. We are going to restrict the subprime mortgages. When we pass the bill to do that first in the House, the Wall Street Journal attacked us for keeping low-income people from getting housing. But they weren't getting housing, they were getting loans that collapsed. Secondly, we're going to put restrictions on the derivatives, which includes credit default swaps. No one will be allowed to sell those forms of insurance without putting up enough money so that they can be guaranteed to pay off if they fail. Third, we are going to have a Council of Federal Regulators that will look at these agencies, as no one did with AIG, and say, whoa, 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 you were way overextended, pull back. You can't sell anymore. Now, that's the first thing we do. We try to make it less likely these things happen. Secondly, though, they may still happen. You can't do it perfectly. Here's the problem. Last year in September, Lehman Brothers collapsed. There were, I should go back to that. If a bank failed, we read about bank failures, we have special rules that allow the regulators to put that bank out of business, but in an orderly fashion. They pay some people and not others. They can calm it down. But for non-bank financial institutions, there are no such rules. So Lehman Brothers failed, and they couldn't pay anybody. When they didn't pay anybody on Lehman Brothers, the Bush administration said terrible things. The economy is shutting down because nobody would lend anybody to anybody. That was what they came and told us. And by the way, I would say this. I think they were probably right. I think the failure of any of the people who were owed money by Lehman Brothers to get paid was a problem. But even if it hadn't been a problem, when the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, announced that the world is going to end unless you do something, then the world will end unless you do something. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't think it was, but if it hadn't been, it would have been. So we had to respond. But then what happened was Lehman Brothers fails, and they think, literally, people stop lending money, the economy dries up. The next day, AIG fails, and then they said, oh my God, we can't have two of these. So they rush into AIG and they pay everybody. The other thing we're going to do is to give them, in the non-bank financial area, the ability to do what their banks. Pay only as many people as they think to avoid a total disaster. And also there are rules that say, okay, remember AIG is still going. We're going to say, fine, you may have to pay off some of these people, but it's a death sentence. We're going to pay their funeral expenses, not their living expenses. If that would happen in the future, AIG would be dissolved. All the shareholders would be wiped out. The board of directors would be fired. The CEO would be fired. The federal government would put a receiver in who would wind it down. Some of the people might be paid, others not. And they also wouldn't be paid with taxpayers' money the way they are today. We're going to have a provision there that says every financial institution that has more than $10 billion in assets is going to begin to have to contribute money to a fund. And that fund is what we will use if we have to do some payoffs. So that's the package of changes. Very partisan. Republicans don't like it. But I think that it's equivalent to what Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson did with the antitrust laws, and what Franklin Roosevelt did with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We want innovation. We want investment. But that's it. I think we probably have time for one more. Yeah.
In 2003, you opposed the Bush administration proposal to transfer oversight of Fannie and Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to the Treasury Department. And you said that these two entities were in no financial crisis. Do you still stand by this? Or
No, in fact, I changed that in 2005. The first thing I would say is this. In 2003, by the way, the Republicans were going to Congress. Tom DeLay was going to Congress. He wasn't listening to me. And if the Republicans wanted, George Bush was the president, in 2003, the Republicans had big control of the House and the Senate because of the 2002 elections. They did not do anything. In fact, the Republicans controlled Congress from 1995 to 2006. They didn't pass any legislation to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I was originally opposed to what they were trying to do. I later supported it, but I was not in charge of their failure. What then happened was this. In 2004, and you're right, 2003 is the year. In 2004, George Bush ordered Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to increase by a significant amount the number of mortgages they bought from low-income people. I said at the time it was a mistake. I said in a clipping from Bloomberg News. Because I believe that the best way to provide housing for lower-income people was through rental housing. And I wanted Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to do more low-income rental housing. I was skeptical that many of these low-income people would be able to afford these homes, and frankly, in some cases, that they would be able to manage them. Home ownership is not a slam dunk. You need to be well enough organized to do it. If you are a single parent, set at the bump with your kids, barely able to make ends meet, you probably are not in a position to be a homeowner, to deal with the roof problem, to deal with this problem or that problem. At any rate, in 2004, I objected, but if the Bush administration ordered Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to increase, we then, some of us in the Congress, did two things. First of all, we tried to pass a bill, Democrats, to restrict subprime mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. And we tried to get a bill passed, including a couple of guys in North Carolina who work with a major North Carolina group called the Center for Responsible Lending. The Republicans who controlled Congress refused to do that. Tom DeLay told the chairman of the committee, Mike Oxley, we don't believe in that, that's regulation. The other thing we did then, though, was I did then join the Republicans in trying to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In 2005, the Republicans, still in control of Congress, passed a bill through the House to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mike Oxley did it. Oxley was a pretty good regulator. He's the Oxley of Sarbanes-Oxley, the major corporate reorganization after Enron. He then got into a fight with the Bush administration. He passed the bill. By the way, I voted for the bill in committee and helped to pass it. When it got to the floor of the House, I opposed it.